The morning sun rose over the Hawaiian waters on that December 7th, 1941, casting long shadows across the battleships moored at Pearl Harbor. What began as a Sunday in paradise ended as America's darkest day. The Japanese had struck with devastating precision, and the world would remember this assault as the moment that thrust the United States into the Second World War. Yet within this catastrophe lay the seeds of an extraordinary reversal, a reversal that would culminate 6 months later in the waters northwest of Midway Atoll, where the balance of naval warfare in the Pacific would shift irrevocably. In the months following Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Imperial Navy seemed invincible. The attack had crippled America's battle fleet, sending 8 battleships to the harbor floor or into repair yards that would keep many of them occupied for years. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant and calculating Japanese commander who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor assault, had achieved his strategic objective with remarkable efficiency. He knew, however, that this victory would be temporary. America's industrial capacity was virtually unlimited, and her people, once unified in purpose, would fight with a determination born of wounded pride. The window for Japanese expansion was narrow, and Yamamoto understood this with a clarity that eluded many of his contemporaries in Tokyo. The early months of 1942 saw a cascade of Japanese conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Philippines fell under the relentless advance of Japanese forces. Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, and French Indochina became Japanese-occupied territories. The rising sun flag flew over vast expanses of territory, and Japanese commanders spoke confidently of a new order in Asia. Yet even as these territorial gains accumulated, American forces, though severely depleted, refused to surrender their fighting spirit. The aircraft carrier, rather than the battleship, had emerged as the dominant instrument of naval warfare, a fact starkly illustrated by the events at Pearl Harbor itself, where the battleships lay in shallow water, but the carriers, fortunately, were at sea. American leadership understood the precarious position in which they found themselves. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, appointed commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, was a man of unusual strategic vision and calm determination. He knew that with the battleship arm of the fleet crippled for years to come, the survival of the carrier force became paramount. The USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornet would have to serve as the shield behind which America could regroup and rebuild. In the meantime, these ships and their air groups composed of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters would have to contend with a Japanese navy that had enjoyed unopposed dominance for months. The Japanese plan for the spring of 1942 centered on Operation MO, an attempt to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea and thus extend Japanese dominance southward toward Australia. This operation would bring Japanese and American carriers into conflict for the first time in the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May. There, in that encounter, neither side's battleships fired a shot. The entire battle was conducted by carrier-based aircraft, operating beyond the range of surface-to-surface gunfire. The Americans and Japanese, though neither force defeated the other decisively, both learned lessons that would shape future naval warfare. The USS Lexington went down in flames, and the USS Yorktown suffered damage that would require weeks of repair. Yet American pilots had proven they could stand toe-to-toe with the vaunted Japanese Zero fighters and their experienced pilots. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility had received its first meaningful crack. The Coral Sea had been a strategic draw, but it proved consequential. Operation MO had been halted, and Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. More importantly, the action had convinced Yamamoto that he must bring the American carrier force to decisive battle. The Admiral devised Operation MI, a plan to capture Midway Atoll and thus compel what remained of the American fleet to fight. The islands of Hawaii would then be within striking distance, and the destruction of American sea power would leave the west coast of the United States vulnerable to potential invasion or, at minimum, sustained Japanese aggression. It was an ambitious plan, predicated on maintaining surprise and concentrating Japanese naval strength against a weakened American force. What Yamamoto did not fully appreciate was that American intelligence, working behind the scenes, had made significant progress in breaking Japanese naval codes. Station Hypo, a naval cryptanalytic unit based at Pearl Harbor, had begun to make sense of the Japanese Navy's coded communications. The JN-25 code, which was the Japanese Navy's primary cipher system, was proving vulnerable to sustained cryptanalytic attack. A team of brilliant codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had managed to achieve a partial solution to the code by late May 1942. Crucial intercepts began to reveal the Japanese operational plan for Operation MI. American intelligence officers studied these fragments and began to construct a picture of Japanese intentions. The target was almost certainly Midway. The date appeared to be early June. The Japanese would commit the bulk of their carrier strength to the operation. Admiral Nimitz received this intelligence with the calm recognition of a strategist who understands that information, however reliable, must still be tested against the fog and uncertainty of combat. He made a crucial decision. The American fleet would sort forth to contest the Japanese operation. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, would take positions northeast of Midway, lying in ambush for the approaching Japanese fleet. The USS Yorktown, though damaged at the Coral Sea, had been hastily repaired and would sortie with Task Force 17 under the command of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Nimitz emphasized to his commanders that they would have the advantage of fighting from a position near their own airbase at Midway. They would also fight with the crucial advantage of foreknowledge of Japanese plans. The Japanese, by contrast, still operated under the assumption that they possessed surprise. Yamamoto's combined fleet represented an impressive concentration of naval power. 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the heart of the Japanese striking force. These ships had been the spearhead of Japanese expansion and were now commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a cautious commander who lacked Yamamoto's broader strategic vision. Aboard these carriers were highly trained pilots, many of them veterans, of countless combat missions over China and against the weak American air arms they had encountered so far. The Japanese believed themselves to be confronting a demoralized enemy with fewer and less capable aircraft. They had no way of knowing that American codebreakers had unveiled their plans and that American carriers were already moving into position to meet them. The first week of June, 1942, saw the Japanese fleet steam eastward across the Pacific toward Midway. The distance was vast, and the operation depended on meticulous timing and the assumption of surprise. The Japanese took precautions to maintain secrecy, but they could not counter the intelligence that was already in American hands. On June 3rd, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted the leading elements of the Japanese fleet, and the first phases of the battle began. American bombers, operating from Midway itself, launched attacks on the Japanese invasion force. These attacks, carried out by B-17 Flying Fortresses and Brewster F-2A3 Buffalo fighters, were largely ineffective, but they served notice that the American presence could not be ignored. Japanese commanders began to suspect that surprise had been compromised, though they did not fully understand the scope of American foreknowledge. On the morning of June 4th, the moment that would determine the course of the Pacific War arrived. The Japanese carriers had launched their aircraft to strike Midway. Waves of Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, HED-3A Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers streamed toward the atoll. The Japanese pilots, their faith in their aircraft and their own abilities reinforced by months of victories, approached their target with confidence. What they did not know was that American carriers were approximately 200 miles to the north and northeast, with their own aircraft already being launched to intercept and counter the Japanese force. The great exchange of aerial combat that followed would unfold across a vast area of ocean, with the outcome determined by factors ranging from tactical decisions made in seconds to luck and chance. The American pilot formations, though smaller in number than their Japanese counterparts, had certain advantages beyond the crucial factor of surprise. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, while inferior in many respects to the Zero, had armor and self-sealing fuel tanks that gave American pilots a better chance of surviving combat damage. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, despite its relatively modest specifications, was an exceptionally sturdy and accurate dive bomber. Above all, American pilots fought, knowing that they could bail out over or near their own territory and live to fight again, while Japanese pilots who were shot down over Midway faced either capture or death by drowning. The Americans, moreover, were fighting for their homeland. They had absorbed the shock of Pearl Harbor and were determined to exact a price for that assault. The Japanese 1st Air Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Nagumo, faced a series of decisions that morning that would reverberate through the remainder of the war. After launching their strike against Midway, Nagumo retained a reserve of aircraft for any eventuality, and he began to consider whether to launch a second wave of aircraft against Midway or to prepare for the possibility of American carriers being in the vicinity. This was a crucial decision point. Japanese reconnaissance had been hampered by weather and the vast distances involved in the operation, and the location and disposition of American carriers remained uncertain. Nagumo, operating under the weight of command responsibility and the fog of war, made decisions that would prove fateful. The American carriers launched their air groups in the direction of the Japanese fleet. The USS Yorktown sent her aircraft on a course toward the Japanese position. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, operating together under Admiral Spruance's tactical command, launched their full complements of aircraft. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's dive bombers, and the pilot formations from the Hornet began their approach to the enemy fleet. The distances were such that a mistake in navigation or a miscalculation in timing could prove catastrophic. Pilots could run out of fuel short of both the Japanese fleet and their own ships. The battle would ultimately turn on moments of intense pressure and split-second decisions. The Japanese Kate torpedo bombers, attacking in the traditional horizontal bombing approach, proved to be dreadfully vulnerable to American fighter opposition. The Devastator torpedo bombers from the American carriers also suffered grievously. The slow, ungainly aircraft were easy prey for Japanese Zero fighters, and wave after wave of American torpedo bombers were shot down before reaching their target. It was a grueling phase of the battle, one in which American pilots displayed extraordinary courage despite the devastating losses they sustained. Their sacrifice, however, served a crucial purpose. While the Japanese Zero fighters were focused on these low-altitude torpedo bombers, the American dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Commander McCluskey, approached at high altitude. The Japanese carriers, caught in a moment of vulnerability with many of their fighters engaged at low level against the attacking torpedo bombers, could not bring their anti-aircraft defenses to bear with full effect against the diving American aircraft. The dive bombers from the Enterprise roared down toward the Japanese carriers. The Akagi, flagship of the Japanese fleet, had recently struck down aircraft to the hangar deck for refueling and rearming, when bombs from the American dive bombers screamed toward her. Near misses erupted in great plumes of water, and then a bomb struck her flight deck, followed by others. Fires erupted on the great carrier, fed by the fuel and ordnance of the aircraft now ignited on her decks. The Kaga, another of Japan's finest carriers, suffered a similar fate moments later. American pilots from the Yorktown's air group, operating from a different approach vector, descended on the Soryu. Her flight deck erupted in flames. 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were now crippled and burning, victims of an American counterattack that had required precise timing, considerable courage, and the element of surprise. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, fought back with determination. Her pilots launched aircraft against the American carriers, and the USS Yorktown took bomb hits and nearly succumbed to torpedo damage before being abandoned and later sunk. The crew of the Yorktown, though she went down, had gained time and had absorbed Japanese attacks that might otherwise have been directed at her sister ships. The Enterprise and Hornet, meanwhile, continued to operate, and American aircraft from these ships succeeded in locating and attacking the Hiryu as the day wore on. Dive bombers from the Enterprise scored hits that set the great carrier ablaze. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were crippled and sinking. The greatest concentration of Japanese naval power had been broken in a single day of intense combat. The American victory at Midway was not unambiguous or complete. The Japanese retained a carrier force in the form of the Zuiho, Shokaku, and other vessels not committed to the battle. Japanese battleships and cruisers had not yet engaged the American surface fleet. Yet, the psychological and strategic impact of the American success was immense. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been decisively shattered. The carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were no longer a threat to American operations. American pilots had proven that they could defeat their Japanese counterparts in favorable circumstances. Most importantly, the initiative in the Pacific had begun to shift from the Japanese to the Americans. The battle itself had been decided by a combination of factors. American intelligence had been crucial. Without the code breaking that had revealed Japanese intentions, the American carriers might not have been in position to contest the operation. Luck had played a significant role. Weather conditions, navigation errors, and split-second timing had all influenced the outcome. The courage and sacrifice of American pilots, many of whom died in the attack on Japanese carriers, had been essential. Japanese commanders, operating without adequate information about American force dispositions and with aircraft that were fully committed to the attack on Midway, had been unable to adjust their plans quickly enough. Commander Nagumo, despite his competence as a naval officer, had not possessed the strategic vision and flexibility required to respond effectively to the emergence of American carriers at a crucial moment. In the broader context of American strategy in the Pacific, Midway represented a psychological as well as a material turning point. American officers and men, who had suffered months of defeats and withdrawals, now had proof that the enemy could be beaten. Industrial workers in American factories, laboring to produce the aircraft and ships required for eventual victory, had tangible evidence that their efforts were making a difference. American political leaders and the American people received news of a great victory that helped to sustain the will to fight and win, even as the war in Europe demanded vast resources and attention. The Japanese, by contrast, faced a strategic dilemma that would become increasingly acute as the war progressed. They could no longer command the sea with the same confidence. The 4 carriers lost at Midway represented not merely ships but also the trained pilot personnel who could not easily be replaced. Japanese pilot training policies, unlike those of the Americans, did not systematically rotate experienced pilots back home to train new pilots. Instead, the best Japanese pilots flew repeatedly until they were killed in action. As losses accumulated and experienced pilots fell in combat, the overall quality of the Japanese air arm declined steadily. American pilot training, by contrast, employed the system of rotating experienced pilots stateside to train the next generation. Over time, this fundamental difference in personnel policy would contribute to American aerial superiority. The tactical and operational implications of Midway rippled through subsequent campaigns. In the long slog northward through the Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, and eventually to the Philippines, American forces would enjoy advantages in carrier aviation that the Japanese, having replaced their lost ships with less capable vessels, could not match. The Zuiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and other carriers that Japan built to replace those lost at Midway were good ships, but they did not represent the same concentration of experienced pilot talent. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, 2 years after Midway, would see American carrier pilots achieve such a decisive victory over their Japanese counterparts that the encounter became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The foundation for that victory had been laid at Midway. For Admiral Chester Nimitz, the victory at Midway vindicated his decision to trust intelligence assessments and position his carriers to intercept the Japanese striking force. His calm under pressure and his willingness to take calculated risks based on the best available intelligence became hallmarks of his leadership throughout the war. Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding the Yorktown Task Force, had made crucial decisions regarding the positioning of his force and the launching of his aircraft. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Enterprise and Hornet Task Force, had made the critical decision to continue launching aircraft even when the exact position of the Japanese fleet was uncertain. These decisions, made under tremendous pressure and with incomplete information, had proven correct. The Japanese strategic situation, meanwhile, underwent a fundamental transformation. What had begun as a period of Japanese expansion and American retrenchment now became a war in which the initiative gradually shifted toward America. The distance between Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and Midway in June 1942 was only 6 months, yet in that short span, the character of the Pacific War had been dramatically altered. American industrial capacity, mobilized for war production, would now produce ships, aircraft, and supplies at a rate that would eventually overwhelm Japanese resources. The American people, shocked and angered by the attack on Pearl Harbor, had now experienced a great victory that vindicated their determination to see the war through to a successful conclusion. The human element of the battle cannot be overlooked. American pilots, who had trained hard but who had limited combat experience when the war began, had learned through bitter experience at places like the Coral Sea how to fight the Japanese. They had absorbed lessons about the strengths and weaknesses of their own aircraft and those of their opponents. The Wildcat, though inferior to the Zero in many respects, could turn tighter than American pilots had initially believed, and aggressive tactics had proven effective. The SBD Dauntless, though it looked ungainly and obsolete to modern eyes, had proven to be one of the most effective weapons of the war. Japanese pilots, conversely, had never had to adapt to serious opposition and had perhaps become overconfident in their abilities and their equipment. At Midway, they encountered opposition that matched and eventually surpassed them. The code-breaking that had made the American victory possible was itself a remarkable achievement that deserves emphasis. The men and women of Station Hypo, working with limited resources and under the pressure of a desperate strategic situation, had managed to penetrate the JN-25 code to a sufficient degree to provide American commanders with the operational intelligence they needed. This intelligence had been communicated to Admiral Nimitz with appropriate caveats regarding uncertainty and the possibility of deception. Yet Nimitz had chosen to act on the intelligence, positioning his carriers in a location that could be reached by Japanese forces, but from which they could also launch their own aircraft. The decision to trust intelligence, coupled with the achievement of the codebreakers themselves, had paid enormous dividends. The Japanese, for their part, had believed that the destruction of the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor would be sufficient to break American will to resist, or, alternatively, to force a decisive naval battle between battleships in which Japanese advantages in armor and firepower would prove decisive. They had not anticipated that the Pacific War would be fought largely by carrier-based aircraft, nor had they fully grasped the productive capacity of American industry. Yamamoto, more than most Japanese leaders, understood these limitations and realities, but even he could not convince the Japanese government to seek a negotiated settlement before American power became overwhelming. The opportunity that existed in December 1941 had begun to close by June 1942, and it would close entirely within the next year. The aftermath of Midway saw American forces assume the strategic offensive, albeit in a limited capacity. The invasions of Guadalcanal and other Solomon Islands followed in the months after Midway. American pilot replacements and new aircraft poured into the Pacific theater. The Navy commissioned the Essex-class fleet carriers, a new generation of ships that would come to dominate carrier operations in the later stages of the war. American tactics continued to evolve, with pilots and commanders learning to exploit the advantages of their aircraft and disadvantages of the enemy. Japanese carriers, damaged at Midway or retained in reserve, were not replaced at an equivalent pace. The disparity in industrial capacity, which had been a disadvantage for America at the beginning of the war, became an increasingly decisive factor as the conflict continued. The human stories of Midway are as important as the strategic outcome. Pilots who had survived combat over the Pacific for months flew into that battle knowing that they might not return. Some were veterans of Pearl Harbor or the early campaigns. Others were relatively new to combat. Many of them did not return. The carrier air groups suffered devastating losses. Some squadrons lost the majority of their pilots, yet those who survived became the cadre of experienced flyers who would train the next generation. The carrier crews worked under conditions of intense stress, maintaining and servicing aircraft while under air attack, processing damage reports, and attempting to keep their ships operational despite serious injuries. The losses at Midway were significant for the Americans, but they could be absorbed and replaced. For the Japanese, the losses were irreplaceable. Looking backward from the perspective of history, the Battle of Midway emerges as one of the truly decisive battles of the Second World War. It was not decisive in the sense of ending the Pacific conflict, for that would require years more of bitter fighting and hundreds of thousands more casualties. Rather, it was decisive in the sense that it marked the transition from a period when American defeat seemed possible or even probable to a period when American victory, though still distant and requiring great sacrifice, became increasingly certain. The war would continue for another 3 years and 4 months after Midway, and the ultimate victory would require the atomic bomb, massive amphibious assaults, the mobilization of the entire resources of the American people. Yet the trajectory of the war was set at Midway. The Japanese had struck a devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, but they had failed to destroy American will or capacity to fight. American pilots, American ships, American industrial might, and American determination had turned the tide. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting on the battle, would later state that Midway had been the turning point of the Pacific War. The Japanese, though not fully appreciating the magnitude of their defeat at the moment it occurred, would eventually come to understand that their strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Japan would continue to inflict significant casualties on American forces and would mount impressive defensive operations, but the possibility of extending Japanese dominion or of forcing a negotiated settlement had been foreclosed at Midway. The American carriers that fought there, though they suffered losses, and the USS Yorktown was lost, had proven that American naval aviation was a match for the famous pilots of Japan. The pilots themselves, many of whom would fly again in later battles, had demonstrated a combination of courage, skill, and determination that would sustain American operations through the long road to victory. The greater significance of Midway, however, lies not in the immediate tactical success, but in the reversal of fortune that it symbolized and actualized. 6 months before Midway, American forces had been in retreat across the Pacific. The Japanese had conquered vast territories and seemed poised to dominate the Western Pacific indefinitely. The mood in the United States had been one of grave concern, if not despair, regarding the Pacific theater. The destruction wrought at Pearl Harbor had been shocking and humiliating. 6 months later, with the victory at Midway, the American mood shifted. The enemy could be beaten. American forces could adapt and prevail. The long war ahead would be terrible in its costs, but victory was now seen as possible and, indeed, as increasingly probable. For historians and military scholars, Midway represents a nexus of factors: intelligence, leadership, courage, chance, industrial capacity, and strategic vision that combine to produce an outcome of transcendent importance. It demonstrated the value of superior intelligence and the risks of assuming that surprise could be maintained. It showed the importance of adapting tactics and strategy in response to changing circumstances. It illustrated the human elements of warfare, the courage of pilots facing death, the competence of commanders making decisions under pressure, and the resilience of military personnel confronting unexpected challenges. Most fundamentally, it demonstrated that the tide of war could turn, that even the most powerful and seemingly invincible enemy could be defeated through a combination of planning, courage, and the proper application of force. The Battle of Midway remains, to this day, a touchstone of naval and military history. American military academies study it as an example of the proper application of intelligence and the value of taking calculated risks. Japanese military analysts have examined it extensively, attempting to understand how their forces, which had enjoyed months of uninterrupted success, could suffer such a reversal. The battle has become an archetype of how surprise, preparation, and the courage of fighting men can overcome initial disadvantages. The pilots who flew at Midway, American and Japanese alike, demonstrated that even in an age of great ships and complex logistics, individual courage and skill remained decisive. The 4 Japanese fleet carriers that were lost at Midway, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had become legends in their own time. They had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, had raided across the Indian Ocean, and had been central to Japanese victories across Southeast Asia. Their loss was a shock to the Japanese people and military establishment. Yet more than the loss of ships, the loss of the experienced pilot cadres aboard those carriers represented a wound that Japanese aviation could never fully heal. The pilots who went down with those ships, or died in the surrounding waters, had represented a concentration of experience and talent that could not be quickly replaced. Japan would build more carriers, but she could not build more experienced pilots fast enough to maintain parity with American forces, which replaced their losses and trained new pilots at an increasing rate. The victory at Midway, achieved through the combination of intelligence, strategy, tactics, and courage, stands as a watershed moment in the Pacific War and, indeed, in the Second World War as a whole. It was a battle that could have gone differently had decisions been made differently, had weather been somewhat altered, or had navigation been slightly off. That it turned out as it did was a matter of both fortune and the superior preparation and leadership of American forces. Subsequent generations of American sailors and pilots would benefit from the sacrifice and courage of those who fought at Midway. The war would continue for years, but the direction was now clear. American power, initially shocked and reeling from the Pearl Harbor attack, had begun its inexorable rise. The Battle of Midway marks the moment when that rise became apparent to all observers, when the balance of the Pacific War shifted, and when the long road to American victory began in earnest.